What if you were sent to a foreign country at 14 to marry a stranger? What if your every waking moment, from getting dressed to eating a meal, was a public performance for hundreds of people? What if your failure to produce a child was discussed by every government in Europe? And what if your attempts to find a little privacy, a little piece of a normal life, ended up costing you everything? People think they know Marie Antoinette. They see the big hair, the fancy dresses, the movie glamour, but her real life was stranger, sadder, and far more complex than any film could show. You know, it was a life lived under a microscope where a single misstep could be, twisted into a national scandal. And it all happened to a girl who just wanted to escape. Number 19, was she really an Austrian spy? She was born an Archduchess of Austria. Her official name was Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. She was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. She was never meant to be Queen of France, but politics and fate had other plans. Her family called her Antoine. In France, they would call her L'Autrichienne. The Austrian, it was not a compliment, it was an accusation that followed her from the day she arrived until the day she died. Her marriage was a political deal. It was designed to end a long-standing rivalry between Austria's Habsburg dynasty and France's Bourbon dynasty. For centuries, they had been enemies. This marriage was supposed to create a new era of peace. Marie Antoinette, at just 14 years old, was the living symbol of that peace treaty. She was a political pawn. Her mother, the Empress, never let her forget it. Her primary duty was not to her new husband or her new country. It was to Austria. From the very beginning, the French court was suspicious. She was the outsider. She was the foreigner who came from the country they were taught to hate. Every letter she wrote home was a potential act of treason in their eyes, and she wrote home constantly. Her mother demanded detailed reports. The Empress wanted to know everything. What was the king thinking? What were the court factions planning? Who was in favor and who was out? Marie Antoinette was expected to be her mother's eyes and ears inside Versailles. The Empress's letters to her daughter were relentless. They were a mix of motherly advice and political instruction. She criticized Marie Antoinette's behavior, her failure to get pregnant, her frivolous spending, and woven into all of it were commands. Show favor to this ambassador. Mention this treaty to the king. Do not forget you are a German. Marie Antoinette tried her best to follow these instructions. She was young, and she was desperate for her mother's approval. But every time she did, it fueled the rumors. See? She works for Austria. She puts her family's interests before France's. The truth was, she had very little real political power, especially in the early years. Her husband, Louis XVI, kept her out of his political councils. He loved her, but he did not see her as a political partner. He knew her position was difficult. Any advice she gave him would be seen as Austrian manipulation. So he largely ignored it. This frustrated both Marie Antoinette and her powerful mother. The situation got worse as the years went on. And France became involved in political conflicts where Austria's interests were different. The War of the Bavarian Succession was a key moment. France was hesitant to fully support Austria. Empress Maria Theresa was furious. She blamed Marie Antoinette for not doing enough to influence the king. She wrote her scathing letters accusing her of being a bad daughter and a poor German. At the same time, the French court accused her of pushing the king to spend French blood and money to help her Austrian family. She was trapped. No matter what she did, someone accused her of betrayal. The pamphlets started appearing. These were nasty, anonymous booklets printed and distributed in secret. They called her L'Autrichienne. They accused her of sending French gold to Vienna to fund her brother, the emperor. There was no proof for these claims, but people believed them. The economy was bad, people were struggling, it was easier to blame the foreign queen than to confront the complex problems facing the country. She became the scapegoat for everything. Her attempts to build her own life at Versailles only made things worse. She preferred speaking German with her close friends. This was seen as proof she refused to become truly French. She favored Austrians at court, like the ambassador Mercy Argenteau, who was her mother's informant. He was constantly at her side, advising her, guiding her and reporting her every move back to Vienna. To the French courtiers who were jostling for power, it looked like a foreign conspiracy operating at the heart of their government. When the revolution began, the accusation of being a spy became deadly. Her enemies used it to turn the people against her. They claimed she was part of an Austrian committee that was plotting to destroy the revolution and bring in foreign armies to crush the French people. She did write letters to her brother, the Emperor of Austria, during this time. She was desperate. She was trying to save her family. She hoped for some kind of intervention, maybe a show of force at the border that would scare the revolutionaries into backing down. But in the eyes of the public, this was treason. She was conspiring with the enemy. The fact that France and Austria were on the brink of war made it the ultimate betrayal. At her trial, this was one of the main charges against her. The girl who came to France as a symbol of peace was condemned as an enemy agent. Number 18, why did she have to be stripped naked at the border? The journey from Vienna to Versailles took over 3 weeks. Marie Antoinette was 14 years old. She traveled in a huge convoy of dozens of carriages. It was a slow, grand procession through towns and villages that celebrated her along the way. But the real ceremony, the one that marked her transformation, happened on an island in the middle of the Rhine River near Strasbourg. The river was the border between the German lands and France. The island was considered neutral territory. Here, a special wooden pavilion was built just for this occasion. One side of the pavilion was decorated in the Austrian style. The other side was decorated in the French style. It was here that Maria Antonia of Austria would cease to exist. In her place, Marie Antoinette of France would be created. The ritual was symbolic, and it was absolute. She entered the pavilion from the Austrian side with her Austrian attendants. Inside, she was ordered to remove everything she had brought with her. And that meant everything. She had to take off her Austrian dress, her undergarments, her stockings, her shoes. Every piece of clothing was from her old life. It had to be left behind. For a few moments, the future Queen of France stood completely naked in a room full of people she had just met. It was a profound act of humiliation and submission. She was being erased. Her Austrian ladies in waiting wept as they said their goodbyes. She was not allowed to bring a single person from her childhood with her into her new life. No friends, no servants, not even her pet dog, Mops. He had been her constant companion, and leaving him behind was heartbreaking for her. The rules were cruel, but they were clear. Nothing Austrian could cross the border. Then, her new French attendants, led by the Comtesse de Noailles, entered the room. They brought with them a completely new French wardrobe. They dressed her in a French gown with French undergarments and French shoes. Her hair was styled in the French fashion. When they were finished, she was a stranger to herself. She walked out of the French side of the pavilion, no longer Maria Antonia, but Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. This ceremony was designed to show that she now belonged entirely to France. She had shed her old identity. Her loyalties were supposed to be transferred as easily as her clothes, but for a young girl, it was a traumatic experience. And she later wrote about how she was delivered over to her new country. The language she used suggests how powerless she felt. She was a piece of property being handed from one owner to another. The Comtesse de Noailles, who supervised this ritual, would become her head lady in waiting. Marie Antoinette secretly called her Madame Etiquette. The Comtesse was the living embodiment of the rigid, suffocating rules of the French court. And Marie Antoinette's life from this moment on would be a constant struggle against that etiquette. The stripping ceremony was her first taste of it. It taught her that at Versailles, her body was not her own. It belonged to the state. Her personal comfort, her feelings, her privacy, none of it mattered. What mattered was the symbol she represented. This public stripping was just the beginning. Her entire life would be lived in public. The ceremony at the border was a stark preview of the daily rituals she would have to endure at the palace. Getting dressed in the morning, putting on makeup, eating her meals, and all of it would be done in front of an audience of courtiers. There was no such thing as privacy for a Queen of France. The border ceremony was the moment she learned that difficult lesson. She had to give up not just her clothes and her dog, but her very self. And she spent the rest of her life trying to get a little piece of it back. Number 17, could she really not dress herself? The etiquette at Versailles was a universe of its own. It was a complex system of rules that dictated every single moment of the day. And for the Queen, the most important rituals were the lever, and the coucher, the formal ceremonies of waking up and going to bed. These were not private moments, they were public performances. The morning ritual, the lever, was particularly absurd. Marie Antoinette would be woken up by her first lady of the bedchamber. Then dozens of other ladies and courtiers would be allowed into her bedroom. They were all there to watch her get dressed. The process was governed by a strict hierarchy. The most senior lady present had the right to hand the Queen her chemise, the simple shift that was her first layer of clothing. This could lead to ridiculous situations. One famous story illustrates the madness. One morning, Marie Antoinette was waiting for her chemise. A lady in waiting held it, ready to pass it to her. Just then, a more senior lady, the Duchesse d'Orléans, walked into the room. The first lady had to give the chemise to the Duchesse because she outranked her. But as the Duchesse was about to hand it to the Queen, and even more senior royal, the Comtesse de Provence, the King's sister-in-law, entered. So, the Duchesse had to hand the chemise to the Comtesse. All this time, Marie Antoinette was standing there, shivering, waiting for someone to be important enough to hand her her own undergarment. She later complained about the moment, saying it was odious. She couldn't just pick out a dress she liked. Her wardrobe was managed by a whole team of people. Each morning, a book with fabric samples of all her dresses was presented to her. She would place a pin on the sample of the dress she wished to wear that day. Then the dress would be brought out and the elaborate process of putting it on would begin. This involved corsets that had to be tightly laced, huge panniers hoops that extended the dress sideways, petticoats, and the gown itself. It was a team effort. She was like a doll being dressed by her handlers. The same kind of ritual happened in reverse at night. The coucher was the public ceremony of her going to bed. Again, the court would gather to watch her undress and get into her nightgown. It was a symbol of their access to the monarch, a tradition dating back to Louis XIV. But for Marie Antoinette, who grew up in the much more relaxed Austrian court, it felt like an invasion. She hated these public displays. She saw them as pointless and humiliating. She began to look for ways to escape them. This was one of the first things that got her into trouble at court. She started simplifying the rituals. Sometimes she would already be washed and have her hair partially done before the courtiers were let in, shortening the ceremony. The traditional nobility, whose power and status were tied to these rituals, saw this as a slight. They felt she was robbing them of their ancient rights. They believed she was showing contempt for the traditions of France. Her desire for a simpler, more private way of life led her to the Petit Trianon, her private chateau on the grounds of Versailles. There, the rules were different. She could wear simple white muslin dresses. She could walk in the gardens without a huge entourage. She could be with her close friends without the constant judgment of the court. But this escape also created resentment. People whispered that the Queen was hiding away, snubbing the nobility, and engaging in unknown activities in her private retreat. Her perfectly normal desire for a little privacy was twisted into something sinister. The very etiquette she tried to escape became a weapon used against her. Her critics said she was not just simplifying tradition, she was destroying it. Number 16, did she actually hate her husband at first? When Marie Antoinette met Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, she was 14 and he was 15. It was not a romantic first meeting. It was a political transaction. They were both shy, awkward teenagers who had been pushed together by their families. He was heavy-set, clumsy, and socially inept. He preferred hunting or working with his hands on locks and metalwork to the glittering society of the court. She was lively, graceful, and used to the more informal atmosphere of the Austrian court. They had almost nothing in common. The first years of their marriage were difficult and lonely for Marie Antoinette. Louis was kind to her, but he was also distant and withdrawn. He seemed incapable of showing affection. He would often leave right after dinner to go to his workshop or to study maps. He went to bed early and got up early to go hunting. He left his young wife alone to navigate the treacherous world of the French court. The biggest problem, and the one that became a subject of international gossip, was that the marriage was not consummated for 7 years. This was a disaster. The entire purpose of a royal marriage was to produce an heir. Their failure was a political crisis. Everyone at court knew. The servants whispered, the nobles gossiped, ambassadors wrote detailed reports back to their home countries about the royal couple's bedroom failures. Marie Antoinette was humiliated. She was under immense pressure from her mother, who wrote her constant letters demanding to know why she wasn't pregnant yet. The Empress blamed her daughter, telling her to be more seductive, to try harder to win her husband's affection. But the problem wasn't her. Louis likely had a medical condition, possibly phimosis, which made physical intimacy painful. He was also deeply religious and may have had psychological inhibitions. For 7 long years, they lived together like brother and sister. This difficult situation shaped Marie Antoinette's early behavior at Versailles. She was bored and unfulfilled. Her husband paid her little attention. She had no official duties. So she threw herself into the social life of the court. She loved parties, dancing, gambling, and fashion. She stayed up late, long after her husband was asleep. She formed a circle of friends who were known for their lavish lifestyles and expensive tastes. This was her way of coping with her strange, empty marriage. But this behavior earned her a reputation for being frivolous and wasteful. The public saw a young queen who seemed to care only for pleasure, while her husband was seen as a serious, if dull, man. The contrast was not flattering to her. She was a teenager trying to find happiness in a difficult situation, but her actions were interpreted in the worst possible light. The turning point came in 1777, 7 years into the marriage. Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, came to visit Versailles. He came partly on a fact-finding mission to figure out why his sister wasn't pregnant. He had long, frank talks with both Louis and Marie Antoinette. He spoke to Louis man to man, advising him on what he needed to do. He told his sister to be more patient and affectionate with her husband. Something worked. Shortly after Joseph's visit, the marriage was finally consummated. Their relationship began to change. Once they were able to have a normal marital life, a real affection grew between them. They were very different people, but they developed a deep bond. Louis came to rely on her, and she came to appreciate his quiet strength and his fundamental decency. Their first child, Marie Therese, was born in 1778. The birth of her children transformed Marie Antoinette. She became a devoted mother, and this new role seemed to ground her. The early years of their marriage, with all their awkwardness and frustration, were a product of their circumstances. They were 2 teenagers, forced into a role they weren't ready for. The public image of her as a flighty party girl and him as a bumbling oaf was born in those years. But behind the scenes, they were slowly, painfully building a partnership that would, in the end, see them face the greatest crisis of their lives together. Number 15, how much did her hair weigh? In the 1770s, Marie Antoinette became the undisputed leader of fashion in France, and by extension, all of Europe. And nothing was more extreme than the hairstyle she popularized. The poof was a hairstyle that was less about hair and more about sculpture. It was a towering creation built on a frame of wire and pads of horsehair. The person's own hair was then combed over this structure and supplemented with false hair. The whole thing was held together with a thick, sticky pomade made from animal fat and then coated in white or gray powder made from wheat flour. These creations were not just tall, they were storytelling devices. Women would decorate their poofs with objects that represented their interests or current events. One famous poof was called the Pouf à la Belle Poule. It featured a model of a French warship, the Belle Poule, to celebrate a French naval victory over the British. The ship, complete with masts and sails, would sit on a sea of powdered hair. Another popular design celebrated the new discovery of the smallpox inoculation. It featured a rising sun and an olive tree entwined with a snake, representing medical wisdom. Marie Antoinette's own hairstyles were legendary. For one ball, her coiffure was so tall, decorated with feathers and ribbons, that she had to kneel on the floor of her carriage to travel to the event because she couldn't fit sitting up. These styles could be 3 or 4 feet high. They were incredibly heavy and uncomfortable, and they were a hygiene nightmare. The pomade made from animal fat would go rancid. The structures were difficult to clean, and they often became infested with lice and other creatures. It was not uncommon for women to find mice nesting in their hair. These hairstyles were also hugely expensive. They required a team of hairdressers' hours to create. Marie Antoinette's personal hairdresser, Leonard Audie, became a celebrity in his own right. The cost of the false hair, the elaborate decorations, the powder, and the hairdresser's time was enormous. At a time when many people in France were struggling to afford bread, the Queen's extravagant hair became a symbol of royal wastefulness. The flour used to powder the hair of the aristocracy could have been used to bake countless loaves of bread for the poor. This fact was not lost on the public. The poof craze was a perfect example of Marie Antoinette's political blindness in her early years. She saw it as a form of personal expression and fun. She didn't understand how it looked to the people outside the Versailles bubble. But to them, it looked like she was literally wearing the nation's food in her hair. The political pamphlets of the time made much of this. They depicted her as a clueless, out-of-touch foreigner who cared more about fashion than the suffering of her people. Ironically, Marie Antoinette eventually grew tired of this extreme fashion. After the birth of her first child, she started to favor a simpler, more natural look. She abandoned the giant poofs and heavy makeup. She began wearing simple white muslin dresses inspired by a romanticized idea of country life. She let her hair fall in looser curls. But this change also brought criticism. The French silk industry was furious that the Queen was no longer promoting their luxurious fabrics. They complained that her preference for simple cotton was ruining their business. It seemed she could do nothing right. When she was extravagant, she was condemned for being wasteful. When she was simple, she was condemned for harming French industry. Her every choice, right down to her hair, was political. Number 14, did she lose a fortune in a single night? Versailles was a place of immense boredom for many of its residents. The days were filled with rigid ceremony. To escape this, Marie Antoinette turned to high-stakes gambling. Her favorite games were faro and lansquenet, fast-paced card games where huge sums of money could be won or lost in a single hand. When she became queen in 1774, her private apartments became the center of the court's gambling scene. The games would go on all night. The stakes were astronomical. It was not unusual for a single player to lose the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars in one evening. Marie Antoinette was a reckless gambler. She played with a complete disregard for the value of money. She had grown up in a palace where everything was provided for her. She had no real concept of what a livre, the French currency, was worth in terms of a common person's labor. Her gambling debts quickly spiraled out of control. She had a generous allowance from the state, but it was nowhere near enough to cover her losses. She frequently had to ask her husband, Louis XVI, to pay them off. Louis hated gambling. He saw it as immoral and wasteful. He would scold her and reluctantly pay what she owed, but she would soon be back at the card tables. The problem wasn't just the money she lost, it was the people she played with. She surrounded herself with a fast-living, pleasure-seeking set of nobles. This group, known as the Polignac Circle, was deeply unpopular. They were seen as parasites who were using their friendship with the Queen to enrich themselves. When the Queen gambled with them, it looked like she was allowing her friends to fleece the royal treasury. The stories of her gambling nights spread throughout Paris and beyond. The pamphlets seized on them. They painted a picture of a queen who stayed up all night, gambling away the nation's wealth with her corrupt friends while the good king was sleeping. This narrative was incredibly damaging. It fed into the idea that she was an irresponsible foreigner who was bankrupting France for her own amusement. There were specific instances that became public scandals. On one occasion, the games went on for 36 hours straight. The king himself came to her rooms and begged her to stop, but the game continued. The amounts of her debts were shocking. In 1778 alone, her gambling losses amounted to nearly 500,000 livres. This was a colossal sum, more than many noble families earned in a decade. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, heard about the gambling and was horrified. She wrote scathing letters to her daughter, telling her that her behavior was bringing shame on their family and her new country. "A queen does nothing but what is great and beautiful," she wrote, warning her that gambling was a ruinous passion. For a time, Marie Antoinette would promise to be more careful, but the lure of the game and the escape it offered from her formal duties was too strong. Eventually, as the country's financial crisis deepened, even Marie Antoinette began to realize the political danger of her gambling. She started to play for lower stakes and less frequently, but the damage was already done. The image of the gambling queen was fixed in the public mind. It became part of the larger myth of Madame Deficit, the woman who was single-handedly responsible for France's financial problems. It was an unfair accusation that the country's debts were the result of centuries of overspending and an unjust tax system, but her very visible and very real gambling addiction made the lie believable. Number 13, why did she build a fake farm? One of the most famous and misunderstood things Marie Antoinette ever did was create the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet. On the grounds of her private estate, the Petit Trianon, she had a small rustic village built. It was designed to look like a picturesque Normandy hamlet. It had a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, a dovecote, and a handful of charming cottages with thatched roofs. To her critics, this was the ultimate symbol of her cluelessness. Here was a queen, living in unimaginable luxury, who built a fake peasant village so she could play at being a simple country girl. It seemed to be an insult to the actual peasants of France who were living in real poverty. The story that is often told is that she would dress up as a shepherdess and milk cows that had been specially washed and perfumed for her. The reality was more complex. The Hameau was not just a royal playground. It was part of a larger European trend among the aristocracy for a return to nature. This idea, popularized by philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, held that the natural world was pure and good, while society and city life were corrupting. Nobles all over Europe were building picturesque gardens, grottos, and follies on their estates. The Hameau was Marie Antoinette's version of this. It was a place for her to escape the crushing formality of Versailles. Life at the main palace was a constant performance. At the Petit Trianon, and especially at the Hameau, she could live more simply. She would walk there with her children and her closest friends. She wore simple white muslin dresses, not the heavy formal court gowns. The etiquette was relaxed. It was a private world she created for herself where she could feel like a person instead of a symbol. And it was a real working farm. It wasn't just a movie set. The farm produced milk, eggs, and vegetables that were served at the royal table. She was genuinely interested in agriculture and botany. She wanted her children to understand where food came from. It was an educational project as much as it was a personal retreat. The famous story about her milking perfumed cows is a myth. The dairy was a real functioning one, and while she did have special porcelain milk pails made by the Sèvres factory, her involvement was more about overseeing the farm's operation. But context is everything. The Hameau was built in the 1780s, a time of severe economic hardship in France. The harvests were failing, and the price of bread was soaring. For the people who were starving, the news that the queen had built an idyllic fantasy farm for her own amusement was outrageous. It didn't matter that it was a functioning farm or part of a philosophical trend. The optics were terrible. The pamphlets had a field day with it. They portrayed the Hameau as a place of decadent parties and inappropriate behavior. They spread the false stories about her playing milkmaid, making her seem utterly detached from the reality of rural life. The Hameau, which was intended as an innocent escape, became another piece of evidence in the case against her. It proved to her enemies that she was a frivolous woman who fiddled with a fantasy life while the country burned. What she saw as a private refuge, the public saw as a shocking display of extravagance and a mockery of their own suffering. Number 12, did her friends ruin her reputation? When Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles, she was a lonely teenager in a foreign land. She found the rigid etiquette and the older, more conservative courtiers stifling. She naturally sought out friendships with people who were closer to her own age and who shared her love for fun, fashion, and parties. But her choice of friends would have disastrous consequences for her reputation. Her inner circle was small and exclusive. Two figures stood out, the Duchesse de Polignac and the Princesse de Lamballe. The Princess de Lamballe was a gentle and devoted friend, but she was quiet and serious. It was the Duchesse de Polignac, Yolande de Polastron, who became the center of the Queen's social life. The Polignacs were a charming but impoverished noble family. When Marie Antoinette befriended the Duchesse, she showered the entire family with money, titles, and high-paying jobs. The Polignac circle became a powerful faction at court. They were known for their lavish lifestyle, their informal manners, and their exclusive parties. Marie Antoinette felt comfortable with them. In their company, she could drop the formal madame and be treated like a normal person. They offered her an escape from the pressures of being queen, but to the rest of the court, this looked like cronyism. The old established noble families were furious. For centuries, access to the monarch was the key to power and wealth. Now, this upstart Polignac family was monopolizing the queen's favor. They felt they were being snubbed. They resented the enormous sums of money being given to the Polignacs while they were being ignored. This created a powerful block of enemies for the queen right inside Versailles. These resentful courtiers were the source of many of the vicious rumors that started to circulate about her. The public also grew to hate the Polignacs. They were seen as greedy opportunists who were taking advantage of a naive queen. The pamphlets depicted the Duchesse de Polignac as a corrupting influence, leading the queen into a life of decadence and waste. There were whispers of financial impropriety and scandalous behavior within the queen's private circle. Because these friendships were so exclusive, it was easy for outsiders to imagine the worst. Marie Antoinette was fiercely loyal to her friends. She couldn't see the political damage they were causing her. When her advisors warned her that her favoritism towards the Polignacs was making her unpopular, she ignored them. She felt that, as queen, she should have the right to choose her own friends. She failed to understand that in her position, nothing was truly private. Her friendships were a public and political matter. The relationship with the Polignacs cost her dearly. It alienated the rest of the nobility, creating a powerful group of enemies within the court, and it provided a perfect target for the anti-monarchist propaganda. It was easy to convince the public that the nation's financial problems were caused by the queen giving all the money to her greedy friends. When the revolution began in 1789, the Polignacs were among the first to flee the country. Their close association with the queen made them targets of popular hatred. Marie Antoinette was devastated by their departure, but it was a wise move for them. Their friendship had given them immense wealth and power, but it had helped to destroy the reputation of the queen who had been so generous to them. Her loyalty to her friends ended up being a major political liability. Number 11 was her mother, the original Tiger Mom. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria was one of the most formidable rulers of her time. She was intelligent, hardworking, and a master of political strategy. She was also the mother of 16 children, and she ruled her family with the same iron will that she ruled her empire. For her youngest daughter, Marie Antoinette, her mother's influence was a constant, overwhelming presence, even from hundreds of miles away. From the moment Marie Antoinette left for France, a steady stream of letters flowed between Vienna and Versailles. These were not just chatty family letters, they were instruments of state policy and maternal control. Maria Theresa demanded that her daughter write to her at least once a week, and she subjected every letter to intense scrutiny. The Empress criticized everything. She criticized Marie Antoinette's handwriting, calling it sloppy. She criticized her for not reading enough serious books. She criticized her for her love of fashion and parties. Most of all, she relentlessly criticized her for her failure to become pregnant in the first 7 years of her marriage. The letters on this topic were blunt and often cruel. The Empress blamed her daughter entirely, suggesting she was not doing enough to inspire passion in her husband. She seemed to have little sympathy for the difficult and humiliating position her teenage daughter was in. But the letters were not just about personal behavior, they were political directives. Maria Theresa saw her daughter as an extension of Austrian foreign policy. She expected Marie Antoinette to influence Louis XVI in ways that would benefit Austria. She would give her specific instructions on who to support at court and what political issues to raise with the king. "You know my principles never abandon them," she wrote. To ensure her daughter was following her orders, the Empress had a spy at the French court. The Austrian ambassador, the Comte de Mercy-Argenteau, sent detailed secret reports back to Vienna on everything Marie Antoinette said and did. And he reported on her daily schedule, her conversations, her moods, her health, and her relationship with the king. He also acted as a coach and a handler for the young queen, constantly advising her on how to behave and reminding her of her duties to Austria. Marie Antoinette knew that Mercy was reporting on her, and it created a strange, tense dynamic. She was the Queen of France, but she was still being monitored like a schoolgirl. This constant pressure from her mother had a profound effect on Marie Antoinette. On the one hand, she desperately wanted to please her mother and live up to her high expectations. She felt a deep sense of guilt and inadequacy when she failed. On the other hand, she chafed under the constant criticism and control. Her desire for freedom and privacy at Versailles was, in part, a reaction to her mother's suffocating influence. The Petite Trianon was a world away from both the rigid French court and her mother's watchful eye. Even Maria Theresa's advice, which was often politically astute, could backfire. And when Marie Antoinette did try to get involved in politics at her mother's urging, she was often clumsy and ineffective. It only reinforced the French court's suspicion that she was an Austrian agent working for her family's interests. She was caught in an impossible bind. Maria Theresa died in 1780. Marie Antoinette was deeply grieved by her mother's death. For all the criticism, she had loved her mother and craved her approval. After her mother's death, some historians argue that Marie Antoinette lost her most important, if most difficult, guide. Without her mother's stern letters to rein her in, her spending and her involvement with the Polignac circle increased. Her mother had been a powerful, controlling force in her life, and her absence left a void. The tiger mom from Vienna had shaped her daughter in ways that would echo throughout her entire tragic reign. Number 10, did she really say, "Let them eat cake"? This is the most famous quote attributed to Marie Antoinette. The story goes that when she was told that the poor people of France had no bread to eat, she replied with the callous phrase, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," which translates to, "Let them eat brioche." It paints her as a clueless, heartless aristocrat who was completely out of touch with the suffering of her people. The only problem is, she almost certainly never said it. The phrase itself had been around for a long time before Marie Antoinette ever came to France. It appears in the writings of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his book Confessions, which was written before Marie Antoinette was even queen, he tells a story about a great princess who said these words. He doesn't name the princess, and the story may well be fictional. The phrase was a piece of anti-aristocratic folklore, a way of illustrating the supposed arrogance of the nobility. So how did it get attached to Marie Antoinette? It was a perfect piece of propaganda. It fit the caricature of her that her enemies were already creating. They wanted to portray her as Madame Deficit, the wasteful foreigner who didn't care about the French people. Pinning this heartless quote on her was an incredibly effective way to do that. The story started to spread in pamphlets and popular gossip in the years leading up to the revolution. By the time the revolution began, many people believed it as fact. The truth about Marie Antoinette's character makes the quote even more unlikely. Private letters and accounts from people who knew her show that she was actually a very charitable person. She regularly gave money from her own allowance to poor families. There are records of her paying for food for a starving village, helping to support an orphan, and paying for the care of a peasant who had been injured by a royal carriage. She founded a home for unmarried mothers. She took a genuine interest in the welfare of the poor. This is the complete opposite of the woman portrayed in the "Let them eat cake" story. When she heard of real suffering, her reaction was one of compassion, not scorn. There is a well-documented story of a time when the price of bread was high. She and Louis XVI cut back on their own household expenses at Versailles to donate the money to the poor. She wrote in a letter, "It is quite certain that in seeing the people who treat us so well, despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness." This is not the voice of a woman who would mock the starving. The let them eat cake myth has survived because it's a simple, powerful story. It encapsulates the massive gap between the rich and the poor in pre-revolutionary France. It's easier to blame a single person, a foreign queen, than to understand the complex economic and social forces that led to the revolution. The quote stuck to her because it was what people wanted to believe about her. It was a lie, but it was a useful lie for her enemies. It helped to turn a compassionate, if politically naive woman into a monster in the public imagination. Number 9, how did a necklace she never owned destroy her? The affair of the diamond necklace was one of the most bizarre and damaging scandals of the 18th century. It was a complex con game that destroyed Marie Antoinette's reputation, even though she was completely innocent. The story begins with a necklace. It was an astonishing piece of jewelry, commissioned by the previous king, Louis XV, for his mistress, Madame du Barry. It was made of 647 flawless diamonds, weighing a total of 2,800 carats. It was the most expensive piece of jewelry in the world, with a price tag of 1.6 million livres, an unbelievable fortune. But Louis XV died before the necklace was finished, and Madame du Barry was banished from court. This left the jewelers Bohémer and Bassenger with a very expensive necklace and no buyer. They tried to sell it to Marie Antoinette. She loved diamonds, but even she was shocked by the price. She refused to buy it several times. She reportedly said that France needed more ships for its navy, not more diamonds for its queen. This was a sensible and responsible decision, but her known love for luxury made the story that followed seem believable. Enter the villain of the story, a clever and ambitious con artist named Jeanne de la Motte. She was a descendant of an illegitimate son of a French king, and she craved a return to wealth and status. She managed to get close to the Cardinal de Rohan, a high-ranking but foolish and disgraced churchman. Rohan was desperate to get back into the queen's good graces. Marie Antoinette despised him and refused to even speak to him. Jeanne de la Motte saw her opportunity. She convinced the cardinal that she was a secret confidante of the queen. She started to pass him forged letters, supposedly from Marie Antoinette, that hinted at a softening of her attitude towards him. She even arranged a nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles between the cardinal and a prostitute who was hired to impersonate the queen. In the darkness, the fake queen gave Rohan a rose and a few kind words. The cardinal was completely fooled. Now, for the final phase of the con. Jeanne told the cardinal that the queen secretly wanted to buy the diamond necklace, but couldn't do so publicly because of the country's financial situation. She said the queen wanted him, the Cardinal de Rohan, to act as her secret go-between. He would buy the necklace on her behalf, and she would pay him back in installments. The cardinal, blinded by his ambition and his imagined secret relationship with the queen, fell for it completely. He signed a contract with the jewelers and took possession of the necklace. He then handed it over to Jeanne de la Motte, believing she would deliver it to the queen. Instead, Jeanne's husband took the necklace to London, broke it apart, and started selling off the individual diamonds. The scheme fell apart when the first payment was due, and the jewelers, not having heard from the queen, went to her directly. Marie Antoinette was baffled. She had no idea what they were talking about. When the whole story of the cardinal, the secret letters, and the nighttime meeting came out, she was furious. She felt her name and her honor had been dragged through the mud. Louis XVI had the Cardinal de Rohan arrested publicly, which was a huge mistake. It turned a private scandal into a public spectacle. The cardinal was put on trial. In the trial, his lawyers argued that he was an innocent victim, duped by Jeanne de la Motte. They subtly implied that the queen's own behavior, her reputation for frivolity and secret meetings, made the cardinal's story believable. In the end, the court acquitted the cardinal. This was a disaster for the monarchy. The public interpreted the verdict as a declaration that the queen, not the cardinal, was the guilty party. They believed she had been part of a scheme to get the necklace and then frame the cardinal when it was discovered. Jeanne de la Motte was convicted and imprisoned, but she later escaped and published scandalous memoirs that further blackened the queen's name. The affair of the diamond necklace was a point of no return for Marie Antoinette's reputation. It didn't matter that she was innocent. The scandal confirmed everyone's worst suspicions about her. They saw her as deceitful, extravagant, and morally corrupt. The affair solidified the public's hatred of her and contributed significantly to the climate of anger and distrust that would lead to the revolution just a few years later. A necklace she never wanted, never wore, and never even touched helped to seal her fate. Number 8. Who was the man who tried to save her? Axel von Fersen was a Swedish count, a soldier, and a diplomat. He was handsome, intelligent, and reserved. He first met Marie Antoinette in 1774 at a masked ball in Paris before she was queen. They were both young, and there was an immediate connection. Fersen was a frequent visitor to the French court over the next 2 decades, and he became one of the queen's closest and most trusted friends. The relationship has been the subject of speculation for centuries. Was he her lover? The evidence is inconclusive, but it is clear that they shared a deep and powerful emotional bond. The letters that passed between them are filled with affection and concern. Fersen was one of the few people Marie Antoinette felt she could be completely honest with. He was a loyal and discreet friend in a court full of gossip and intrigue. Unlike many of the people in the Queen's circle, Fersen was not looking for personal gain. He was independently wealthy and had his own distinguished career. He was devoted to Marie Antoinette as a person, not just as a queen. This made his friendship all the more valuable to her. He was her confidant, her supporter, and as the political situation worsened, her most dedicated ally. When the revolution began and the royal family became prisoners in Paris, Fersen's role became crucial. He was one of the few people they could trust. He acted as a secret channel of communication between them and the outside world. He wrote to them in code and sympathetic ink, carrying their letters at great personal risk. He worked tirelessly to try to find a way to save them. His most famous effort was the planning and execution of the royal family's flight from Paris in June 1791, known as the Flight to Varennes. Fersen planned every detail of the escape. He arranged for the passports. He commissioned the construction of a special large carriage to transport the family. He secured hundreds of thousands of livres to finance the journey. On the night of the escape, it was Fersen himself, disguised as a coachman, who drove the royal family out of Paris. It was an incredibly brave and dangerous act. The escape, of course, failed. The family was captured in the town of Varennes and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The failure was not Fersen's fault. It was due to a series of delays and mistakes made by the royal family along the way. But the attempt sealed their fate. It proved to the people that the king and queen were trying to flee and join with foreign enemies to crush the revolution. And Fersen was devastated by the failure, but he did not give up. From a safe position in Brussels, he continued to work to save the woman he loved. He tried to organize a coalition of European monarchs to intervene in France. He plotted new escape plans. He sent her secret letters offering words of comfort and hope. One of his last letters to her ends with the heartbreaking words, "I can tell you that I love you, and I will love you to the end." He never saw her again. After her execution, he was consumed by grief. He wrote in his diary, "She whom I loved so, for whom I would have given 1,000 lives, is no more." His own life ended tragically years later, but his story is a testament to his unwavering loyalty and devotion. In a world where Marie Antoinette was surrounded by enemies and fair-weather friends, Axel von Fersen was the one man who risked everything time and again in a desperate attempt to save her. Number 7. Why did she change so dramatically as a mother? In her early years as queen, Marie Antoinette was often criticized for being frivolous and immature. She seemed more interested in parties and fashion than in her official duties. But the birth of her first child, Marie Thérèse, in 1778, marked a profound turning point in her life. Motherhood transformed her. Before she had children, her life lacked a central purpose. She was a queen without real power, a wife in a difficult marriage. Her children gave her that purpose. She became a deeply devoted and hands-on mother, which was unusual for a royal woman of her time. Royal children were typically raised by a large staff of governesses and tutors. They saw their parents only for brief, formal visits each day. And Marie Antoinette rejected this system. She insisted on having her children's rooms close to her own. She spent hours with them each day, playing with them, reading to them, and overseeing their education. She breastfed her second child, the Dauphin Louis Joseph, for a short time, which was unheard of for a queen of France. She wanted to be directly involved in every aspect of their upbringing. Her approach to motherhood was influenced by the new philosophical ideas of the time, particularly those of Rousseau, who championed a more natural and affectionate style of parenting. She created a simpler, more private world for her children at the Petit Trianon and the Hameau. She wanted them to have a taste of a normal life, away from the rigid etiquette of the main court. She had them dress in simple cotton clothes instead of stiff court attire. She taught them to be charitable, often taking them with her to visit poor families and give them food and money. She had 4 children in total. After Marie Therese came Louis Joseph, the heir to the throne, then Louis Charles, who would later become the tragic Los Dauphin. Her youngest child was a daughter, Sophie, who died in infancy. These children were the center of her world. Her letters from this period are filled with loving anecdotes about them. Tragedy struck the family long before the Revolution. Her son, Louis Joseph, was a sickly child. He suffered from tuberculosis of the spine, a painful and debilitating disease, and Marie Antoinette spent years nursing him. She sat by his bedside, cared for him, and read to him. His slow, painful decline was agonizing for her. He died in June 1789 at the age of 7, just as the French Revolution was beginning to explode. The deputies of the new National Assembly offered their condolences, but they refused to even postpone their political meetings for a day of mourning. For Marie Antoinette, this was a moment of profound personal grief overshadowed by a national crisis that showed no sympathy for her loss. The experience of being a mother, especially a mother of a suffering child, gave her a depth and seriousness that she had lacked in her youth. It grounded her. It also made her more politically aware. She was no longer just a queen, she was a mother fighting for the future of her children and the inheritance of her son. And much of her political activity during the Revolution was driven by this fierce maternal instinct. During her imprisonment, her role as a mother was all she had left. She focused all her energy on caring for and educating her 2 remaining children, Marie Therese and Louis Charles. She taught them their lessons, mended their clothes, and tried to create a sense of normalcy in their terrifying new reality. The most painful moment of her imprisonment was when her son, Louis Charles, was taken away from her. This was a blow from which she never truly recovered. Her last letter, written on the night before her execution, was addressed not to a king or an emperor, but to her sister-in-law, begging her to look after her children. In the end, it was not as a queen, but as a mother that she defined herself. Number 6. What was in the poisonous pamphlets? Long before the Revolution, a war of words was being waged against Marie Antoinette. This war was fought with cheap, secretly printed pamphlets known as labels. These were nasty, slanderous booklets filled with gossip, political attacks, and outrageous lies. They were the social media of their day, and they were incredibly effective at destroying the Queen's reputation. The pamphlets started by attacking her as a foreigner, L'Autrichienne. They accused her of being an Austrian spy, of sending French money to her brother in Vienna, and of putting Austrian interests before French ones. This was a powerful line of attack, because it played on the long-standing French distrust of Austria. Then, they attacked her for her spending. They called her Madame Deficit. They wildly exaggerated her expenses on clothes, jewels, and parties. They blamed her for the country's massive debt, ignoring the fact that the debt was the result of generations of royal spending and expensive wars, like the American Revolution. The pamphlets created a simple, compelling narrative the country is broke because the Queen is a shopaholic. It was a lie, but it was a believable lie to people who saw the obvious extravagance of the court. The most vicious attacks, however, were personal and deeply cruel. The pamphlets began to spread rumors about her private life. Because her marriage was unconsummated for 7 years, the pamphlets claimed she was seeking satisfaction elsewhere. They accused her of having numerous affairs with both men and women. Her brother-in-law, the Comte d'Artois, and her friend Axel von Fersen were named as lovers. Her close friendships with the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac were twisted into something scandalous. These pamphlets were often illustrated with crude and shocking drawings. They depicted the queen in all sorts of compromising situations. The goal was to portray her not just as a bad queen, but as a degenerate and immoral woman. They wanted to strip her of her dignity and her humanity. The language used was brutal and dehumanizing. They called her a harpy, a monster, a she-wolf. This constant stream of poison had a devastating effect. It was impossible to fight back against anonymous lies. The pamphlets were passed from hand to hand in the cafes and markets of Paris. People who could not read had them read aloud. Over time, the lies began to be accepted as truth. Even people who had never seen the queen came to hate her based on the caricature created by the libelles. Marie Antoinette was aware of these attacks. They caused her immense pain. She once came across a pamphlet seller and was so shocked by the vile images of herself that she fainted. She couldn't understand the depth of the hatred directed at her. She had tried to be a good queen, but her every action was twisted and used against her. Her desire for privacy was portrayed as a cover for scandalous behavior. Her friendships were seen as corrupt. Her charity was dismissed as a publicity stunt. When she was put on trial, the accusations made against her by the public prosecutor were taken almost directly from the pages of these pamphlets. The years of slander had done their work. They had created an image of a monster in the public mind. And it was this image, not the real woman, that was ultimately put on trial and condemned. The libelles were a powerful weapon of political assassination, and Marie Antoinette was their primary victim. Number 5, how did one bad decision seal their fate? By the spring of 1791, the royal family were prisoners in all but name. They were confined to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, watched constantly by National Guards. The French Revolution had stripped the king of his absolute power, and the situation was becoming more radical and more dangerous every day. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI decided that their only option was to escape. The plan was masterminded by Marie Antoinette's loyal friend, Axel von Fersen. The goal was to flee Paris and travel to the fortress town of Montmédy on the northeastern border of France. There, they would be under the protection of a loyalist army commander, the Marquis de Bouillé. From this safe position, the king hoped to be able to renegotiate the terms of the new constitution from a position of strength. It was not, as was later claimed, an attempt to flee France and join a foreign army. It was an attempt to get to a safe part of France to rally support. The plan was complex and full of risks. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the family disguised themselves. The king dressed as a valet, the queen as a governess, and the children as the governess's daughters. They slipped out of the palace one by one and made their way to a rendezvous point where Axel von Fersen was waiting with a getaway carriage. He drove them to the outskirts of Paris, where they transferred to a larger, specially built coach for the long journey to the border. This coach was the first of several bad decisions. It was a huge, slow, and conspicuous vehicle called a berline. It was painted a bright yellow and green. It was comfortable, but it drew attention everywhere it went. A smaller, faster, less obvious pair of carriages would have been a much better choice. The journey was plagued by delays. They were several hours behind schedule. This meant that the detachments of royalist soldiers that had been placed along the route to protect them had to disperse before the carriage arrived, so as not to arouse suspicion. At one stop, the king, Louis XVI, made another critical mistake. He got out of the coach and was recognized by a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet. Drouet was a fervent revolutionary. He had seen the king's face on the new French paper money, the assignats. Drouet rode ahead on a fast horse to the next town, Varennes, and alerted the local authorities. When the royal family's carriage lumbered into Varennes late that night, the road was blocked by a barricade of furniture. The local National Guards surrounded the coach. A local official asked for their passports. The king continued to pretend he was a valet, but the deception was useless. They were recognized. The family was forced to get out and wait in the house of a local official while a messenger was sent back to Paris. The escape was over. The journey back to Paris was a nightmare. The family was escorted by National Guardsmen and surrounded by huge, angry crowds who screamed insults at them. The return to the city was a public humiliation. They were no longer seen as monarchs, but as traitors. The flight to Varennes was a catastrophic turning point. Before the escape attempt, there was still a possibility of establishing a constitutional monarchy in France, with the king as a respected, if less powerful, head of state. But the flight destroyed all trust in the king. It proved to the people that he was not willing to accept the revolution. It showed that he was, in their eyes, conspiring with enemies of the state. After Varennes, the calls for the abolition of the monarchy and the creation of a republic grew much louder. The king and queen were now seen as enemies of the people. The escape attempt, which was meant to save them, ended up sealing their fate. It set them on a direct path to their trials and executions. A single, badly planned journey destroyed the last remaining chance for a peaceful resolution. Number 4. What was life like inside a medieval prison? After the monarchy was formally abolished in September 1792, the royal family Louis, Marie Antoinette, their 2 children, and the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth, were moved to the Temple. This was a grim, medieval fortress in the middle of Paris. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of Versailles or even the relative comfort of the Tuileries Palace. The Temple became their world. They were housed in a tower within the fortress complex. Their living quarters were small and sparsely furnished. The windows were barred, and they were under constant surveillance. Guards were present at all times, even during their meals. Their every word and action was noted. They had no privacy. Despite the grim circumstances, Marie Antoinette tried to create a structured and normal life for her family. She established a strict daily routine. In the morning, she would oversee her children's lessons. She taught her daughter, Marie Thérèse, history and music. She taught her son, Louis Charles, how to read. The king took over the lessons in geography and Latin. In the afternoons, they would be allowed a short walk in the fortress garden, always under the watchful eyes of their jailers. In the evenings, the family would gather, the king would read aloud to them, and Marie Antoinette and Madame Elizabeth would do needlework and mend the family's clothes. They had very few possessions, and their fine clothes were wearing out. Marie Antoinette became skilled at darning socks and patching shirts. This routine was a way of maintaining their dignity and their sanity in an unbearable situation. It was a quiet act of resistance against their captors. But the psychological pressure was immense. The guards were often hostile and disrespectful. They would blow smoke in the king's face or sing revolutionary songs outside their rooms at all hours of the night. The darkest day of their imprisonment in the Temple came in January 1793. The king, now referred to as Citizen Louis Capet, was put on trial, convicted of treason, and sentenced to death. On the eve of his execution, he was allowed a final, heartbreaking meeting with his family. Marie Antoinette, his children, and his sister clung to him, weeping. He promised he would see them again in the morning, but it was a promise he could not keep. He did not want to subject them to another painful farewell. The next morning, Marie Antoinette listened, waiting for the sound of the cannons that would signal that her husband was dead. After the king's death, the family's treatment worsened. They were plunged into deep mourning. Marie Antoinette refused to go down to the garden for walks anymore because it would mean passing the door of her husband's empty room. Her main focus was now her son, Louis Charles, who, in the eyes of royalists, was now King Louis XVI. Then came the cruelest blow of all. In July 1793, officials came to their room in the middle of the night and forcibly removed her son from her care. The 8-year-old boy was taken away to be educated as a good Republican citizen. Marie Antoinette fought like a lioness to keep him, but she was powerless. The separation shattered her. She would spend hours staring at a crack in the wall, through which she could sometimes hear the faint sounds of her son in the room below. A month later, in August 1793, Marie Antoinette herself was taken from the Temple. In the middle of the night, she was transferred to the Conciergerie, the prison known as Death's Antechamber. It was the last stop before the Revolutionary Tribunal and the guillotine. Her time in the medieval temple, with its small comforts of family routine, was over. The final terrible chapter of her life had begun. Number 3, did her hair turn white overnight? When Marie Antoinette was transferred from the Temple to her final prison, the Conciergerie, she was a changed woman. She was 37 years old, but she looked much older. Her health was failing. She suffered from constant hemorrhages, likely due to uterine cancer. The years of stress and grief had taken a visible toll. The most striking change was in her hair. The famous blonde hair of her youth was now gray and white. There is a phenomenon known as Marie Antoinette syndrome, or canietis subita, which refers to the hair suddenly turning white after a period of extreme stress or trauma. The story often told is that her hair turned white in a single night after the traumatic flight to Varennes. While this makes for a dramatic tale, it is not medically possible for pigmented hair to lose its color overnight. What is more likely is that a condition called alopecia areata was at play. This is an autoimmune condition often triggered by severe stress, where all the pigmented hairs fall out suddenly, leaving only the white or gray hairs behind. This would give the illusion of the hair turning white very quickly. Another, simpler explanation is that she simply stopped dyeing or powdering her hair. In the 18th century, it was common for aristocratic women to powder their hair white or gray as a fashion statement. It's possible that her natural hair had been graying for some time, but it was hidden. In the harsh reality of prison, with no access to hairdressers or cosmetics, her true hair color was revealed. Whatever the cause, the image of the queen with white hair was a powerful one. It symbolized her suffering and her transformation. The glamorous, frivolous girl of Versailles was gone. In her place was a grieving widow and mother stripped of everything. Her cell in the Conciergerie was a damp, dark room with a straw pallet for a bed. A screen separated her from two guards who were stationed in her cell 24 hours a day. They watched her every move. She had no privacy, not even for the most basic human functions. Her dignity, however, remained intact. The accounts of those who saw her in her final days all speak of her composure, her grace, and her courage. She was allowed few possessions. She had a couple changes of clothes, which she would wash herself in a small bucket. She spent her days reading and doing needlework, mending her clothes until they were threadbare. She was denied any news of her children, which was a constant source of torment for her. During her trial, she appeared before the Revolutionary Tribunal dressed in a simple black mourning dress. She was no longer the dazzling queen of fashion, but a pale, thin woman with white hair. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. She answered the absurd and vile accusations against her with a quiet strength that surprised her accusers. The most infamous accusation was that she had abused her own son. This was a lie forced out of the young Louis Charles by his jailers. When the prosecutor made this accusation in the courtroom, Marie Antoinette, who had remained calm until then, rose to her feet. She turned not to the judges, but to the women in the audience, the mothers of Paris. "I appeal to all mothers present," she said. Nature itself refuses to answer such a charge brought against a mother. Her emotional and powerful response briefly turned the tide of opinion in the courtroom. The women in the crowd murmured in support of her. The prosecutor realized he had gone too far, but the verdict was never in doubt. The trial was a piece of political theater. She was a symbol, and the revolution needed to destroy that symbol. Her white hair, a physical manifestation of her ordeal, became an enduring image of her final days, a testament to the immense suffering she endured with remarkable fortitude. Number 2, what were her final words to her children? On the night of October 15th, 1793, after her trial had ended and she had been condemned to death, Marie Antoinette was taken back to her cell in the Conciergerie. She knew she had only a few hours left to live. She asked for a pen, ink, and paper. There, in the dim candlelight, with her guards watching, she wrote her final letter. The letter was not addressed to a political ally or a fellow monarch. It was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, who was still imprisoned in the Temple and was caring for Marie Antoinette's children. This letter is her last will and testament. It is not the letter of a queen, but of a wife, a mother, and a sister. It is one of the most moving and powerful documents of the period. She began by saying her goodbyes. "It is to you, my sister, that I write for the last time." She explained that she had just been condemned, not to a shameful death, for it is only so to criminals, but to rejoin her husband. She declared her innocence and her Christian faith, forgiving her enemies for the harm they had done to her. Then, she turned to her children. The words she wrote to them are heartbreaking in their love and their wisdom. She asked Elizabeth to pass on her final message to her son, Louis Charles, and her daughter, Marie Therese. To her son, she wrote, "Let my son never forget his father's last words, which I repeat to him expressly, let him never seek to avenge our death." This was an extraordinary plea for forgiveness and an attempt to break the cycle of vengeance that had consumed France. At the very moment of her own unjust condemnation, she was thinking of the future of the country and begging her son not to let bitterness consume him. She then spoke to both of her children. Let them both remember how I have never ceased to instill in them that mutual friendship is the basis of their happiness. She urged them to support each other, to find comfort in their bond. She reminded her daughter to be a support to her brother, to give him the advice that her experience would allow. She asked them to forgive her for any pain she might have caused them. "Let my children forgive me for all the pain I have caused them unwillingly during their childhood." It is a poignant expression of a mother's self-doubt and love. She ended the letter with a final farewell to all her family and friends. "Farewell, my good and tender sister. I embrace you with all my heart, as well as those poor, dear children. My God, how heart-rending it is to leave them forever. Farewell, farewell." After she finished writing, she folded the letter and gave it to one of her jailers, intending for it to be delivered. But it never reached Madame Elizabeth. The revolutionary officials intercepted it. The letter was filed away and was not discovered until many years later. Her sister-in-law and her children never received her final words of love and advice. Madame Elizabeth was herself executed a few months later. Her daughter Marie Therese would be the only member of the immediate family to survive the revolution. She did not see her mother's last letter until long after she was released from prison. Marie Antoinette's final, heartfelt communication to her loved ones was lost, a final, silent cruelty in a life filled with them. Number 1, who was the woman behind the Queen? On the morning of her execution, October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was woken early. Her executioner, Henri Sanson, arrived. He cut her white hair short at the nape of her neck. He tied her hands tightly behind her back. She had hoped to be taken to her death in a closed carriage, a small measure of dignity afforded to the king. Instead, they came for her with an open cart, the kind used for common criminals. She had to be carried through the streets of Paris for over an hour, exposed to the insults and jeers of the massive crowds that had gathered. But she did not flinch. Accounts from eyewitnesses, even those hostile to her, describe her as being pale but calm and composed. She sat erect in the cart, looking straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to the hatred directed at her. The artist Jacques-Louis David, a fervent revolutionary, sketched her as she passed. The drawing shows a proud, defiant woman, her face thin and aged, but her expression unbowed. When she arrived at the Place de la Revolution, she climbed the steps of the scaffold. In her haste, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last recorded words were simple and courteous. "Monsieur," she said to the man who was about to kill her, "I ask your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." These were not the words of a tyrant or a monster. They were the words of a polite, well-mannered woman, even in the face of death. So, who was she really? The woman behind the myth of the extravagant, heartless queen. She was, first and foremost, a product of her upbringing. She was a Habsburg archduchess, raised to be a queen. She had little formal education in politics or history. Her training was in the social graces, music, dancing, and how to behave at court. She was sent to France as a child to be a political pawn, and she was left to navigate the most complex and dangerous court in Europe largely on her own. In her youth, she was undoubtedly frivolous. She was immature. She loved fashion and parties, and she had a poor understanding of the value of money. She made mistakes. Her exclusive friendships created enemies. Her desire for privacy was politically naive. Her spending, while not the cause of the nation's debt, was a public relations disaster. She failed to understand how her actions were perceived by the people she ruled. She was a young woman living in a bubble, and she was slow to realize that the world outside that bubble was suffering. But she was not the monster her enemies made her out to be. She was a loyal friend, a devoted wife, and, above all, a fiercely loving mother. She was capable of great compassion and charity. She was also a person of immense courage. The woman who faced her accusers at her trial and the crowds on the way to the scaffold was not a weak or silly person. She was a woman of incredible strength and dignity. Her life was a story of transformation. The giddy teenager who arrived in France grew into a serious and politically engaged woman. The queen, who once cared only for fashion, became a mother who fought desperately to save her children. The woman who was once surrounded by luxury and flattery ended her life in a bare cell, stripped of everything but her own inner fortitude. The real Marie Antoinette is not the one-dimensional villain of popular history. She was a complex, flawed, and ultimately tragic human being. She was a woman who was placed in an impossible situation at an impossible time. She was judged not for who she was, but for what she represented, the decadence and inequality of a system that was about to be violently swept away. The wild stories of her private life, both the real and the imagined, came to define her. But in her final moments, she showed a quiet courage that transcended all the politics, all the slander, and all the myths, revealing the resilient human being who had been hidden behind the crown for so long.